Hi there, welcome to the battlefield at Princeton, New Jersey. I'm Keith, this is Greg.
Keith is our club's resident history professor, and I used to lead battlefield tours at Gettysburg for the National Park Service. But today, we're not at a national park. This Revolutionary War battlefield is a minimally improved state park. You won't find a visitor center here, hardly any monuments, and only a handful of interpretive signage.
It's a shame, really, because Princeton is one of the most important battlefields of the war.
Absolutely, and there's not even a guided walk or tour at this battlefield. So today, Keith and I are going to remedy that problem for you, and we are going to take you guys on a 6-stop walking tour of Princeton Battlefield.
Along the way, Greg and I will talk about how the battle unfolded and see where some incredible stories of heroism played out.
And we'll find a little bit of time to debunk some popular myths about Princeton, starting with that painting that you just saw depicted on the screen. It's one of the most famous depictions of the entire war, and we'll talk about why it is total bullshit and not historically accurate.
We have a lot to do today, so come join us on the tour.
Well, we didn't get very far now, did we?
Nope, that's because this is the first stop on the tour. The Thomas Clark House is one of the most visible landmarks on this battlefield, and it's just a 2-minute walk from the parking lot.
Maybe a 1-minute walk.
Maybe 30 seconds. I think this is a great place to start because you get a good view of the fighting that happened in the shallow valley below.
Yeah, I think this is the perfect place to get oriented for the battlefield, but it's very important to remember that the terrain in 1777 looked nothing like today. For starters, that major highway that's in our background, that was not here at the time. There were also virtually no trees because this entire area was cultivated, open wheat fields. It was far more open. So open that you could actually see Nassau Hall at Princeton down the road.
We're not going to spend much time explaining the background leading up to this battle, but if you watch our war game video from last week, Greg and I go into pretty good depth about the circumstances leading up to this battle in 1777. And here we are. It's 6 a.m. on January 3rd, 1777, and it's about 20 degrees, so it's really cold, and the fields have a layer of frost on them. Washington's men are marching on a used logging trail back here, making his way towards Princeton.
Yeah, except this time, it's Washington who's in for the surprise. He thinks that he's gonna bag that British garrison up at Princeton, but what he doesn't know is they're already gone. The garrison has already received orders from Cornwallis to join them down along the Assunpink Creek. And on the morning of January 3rd, Colonel Maude has 1,000 men marching down that road on his way to join Cornwallis, when 4 of his dragoons pop up over the ridge and spot elements of the American army in this field around the Thomas Clark House.
And both sides are surprised to see each other. The British think Washington's trapped and ready to be pounced upon, and Washington, for his part, thinks that the 1,000 British that he's seeing are supposed to be sleeping in Princeton.
Yeah, I think that sets the stage pretty nicely for the battle that's about to unfold. So why don't we continue on from here at the Thomas Clark House to stop number 2 on our tour, where we'll take you to see that hidden logging trail that Washington's army was marching along. I know that I just said that most of the trees were gone on this battlefield in 1777, but actually this part of the park was lightly wooded at the time. And this very cool obelisk marks the location of the 12-mile march that Washington and his army took overnight, January 2nd, to reach Princeton.
Now, despite what the obelisk says, we'll give you an insider tip. It's not in the right location. All right, now this trail looks like the one that Washington would have taken as an old logging trail, but it's not. It's an old trolley line. Stop number 3 is a historically accurate trail location, and that's less than 50 yards down the trolley line. So while I did say that the obelisk wasn't in the right location, it's actually not too far off the mark.
Now this stop number 3, is my favorite stop on the entire tour because it's a place that honestly you would never find on your own. If you look around here, there are no interpretive signs or anything marking the location. But what's really cool is that this stone that's sticking up out of the ground, this was here in the 1700s, and it marks the property line between the William Clark farm and the Thomas Clark farm. This old stone also marks the trail that locals in 1777 called the Sawmill Road. That's the path that Washington and his weary army took to reach this battle the night of January 2nd.
Now the Americans came up the trail from this direction, crossing over the modern trolley line, and went between the properties of William and Thomas Clark.
Yeah, if you ever come to Princeton yourself, you definitely need to take a walk back here into the woods. I know it's unmarked, but this is a really neat spot to just feel like you're walking in the footsteps of Washington's army along this line.
There's a little bit of bushwhacking to reach our next stop, and you essentially head north through the woods along a little deer trail. Again, nothing is marked or really maintained in this part of the park. But when you do make it out of the woods, you'll find yourself looking out over the battlefield again.
And then you'll be here at stop number 4. This is one of the few interpretive signs at the park, and it marks the location of 2 American cannon.
Now, at 7 a.m., Hugh Mercer and about 300 riflemen were marching across this very spot and heading down into this little valley. Across the way, Mercer's Americans could see the British forming up on that ridge, ready to meet them, and Maude had turned around from his march to Cornwallis and was ready to defend Princeton.
The battle is about to begin in the valley below us, but remember, Washington and the rest of his army are still strung out on the Sawmill Road, coming through these woods in front of me on their way to Princeton. They have no idea that a major engagement is about to happen.
Hey, you ready to go to my favorite spot? A little oak tree with the fence around it? Now, if you're thinking that little tree must have its own fence because it's important, you're absolutely right. It's not just the most famous tree at this park, it's the most famous tree in this county in New Jersey. Now, at 7 a.m., General Mercer and his men, his riflemen, are down here in the valley, heading towards that modern road to attack the British regulars. Now, rifle fire is great for accuracy. You know what it really sucks at?
Attaching bayonets.
Correct. Long rifles don't work well with bayonets. And at that critical moment, the British launched a furious bayonet charge from that ridge towards Mercer's men, and 300 of them start to run. But not Mercer. Oh no, Mercer's not the running type. Mercer is a badass. Hugh Mercer was a 50-year-old Scotsman who fought in the 7 Years' War in Europe, and then in the French and Indian War. There was an incident in the war that fell in 1756 when Mercer was wounded in a fight and got separated from his unit. He did what any badass would do, trekking alone for 100 miles, injured, without supplies, through the backcountry until he found a friendly outpost.
It was during that war in the colonies when Hugh Mercer first met George Washington, and the two of them became friends.
And by this point, Mercer is probably one of Washington's most trusted generals. He was shot from his horse, he went down, he was surrounded by the British, and they ordered him to surrender, which he did not. Mercer drew his sword instead, and this famous painting shows what happens next. Mercer was bayoneted 7 times and left to die. The painting shows Washington heroically rallying the men in the background, but Washington was not on the field when Mercer went down.
This oak tree behind us is the Mercer Oak, where legend has it that Hugh Mercer was bayoneted to death and killed. This area right now where we're standing is definitely the most famous part of the battlefield. So famous that this entire region of New Jersey is named, you guessed it, Mercer County.
Now, that is just a legend. More likely, Mercer was bayoneted up on the hill there, near the modern highway, but he didn't die right away. Oh no, General Mercer survived the battle and was carried to the Thomas Clark House where we started our tour. He lingered there in agony for 9 days. Hugh Mercer died January 12, 1777.
Now, before you and I move on to the last stop of our tour, I think it is worth pointing out that something very famous happened about 30 yards from our position. In fact, it's one of the most famous incidents of the entire war, and it happened in that field behind us, but there is no marker and no monument to even note it. The British bayonet charge brought them into contact with a large number of American reinforcements that had just arrived on the spot. A brigade of militia, largely from Philadelphia. How do you imagine that the cold, exhausted militia held up against the British bayonet charge?
I'm gonna say not too well.
Yeah, not too well at all. Just like Mercer's riflemen, not long before them, the Philadelphia militia were being swept away from the field, and they were running pell-mell back toward the Thomas Clark House behind us. And that's the moment when George Washington rode out onto the field. Multiple eyewitnesses confirm that Washington rode out in front of the militia, just 50 yards from the British line, urging the Philadelphians to rally. He easily could have been killed like his friend Hugh Mercer, and the painting does mix the timing of both events here, placing them in the same dramatic moment.
Now, it is pretty dramatic stuff, and it worked. Washington rallies the Pennsylvanians and he begins to push the British back.
Very cool, and park historians believe that that dramatic moment happened just in the field behind us, and it definitely turned the tide of the entire battle.
Now, our last stop is across the road, so be sure to cross carefully. It carries a lot of traffic. This large marble monument is clearly the largest structure here, but ironically, it wasn't built as a monument. This was the facade of an old mansion in Philadelphia, relocated to Princeton, and eventually gifted to the state of New Jersey in 1957. They chose to put it here.
Even though it was more of an afterthought, this is a very impressive portico, and it's a good place for us to wrap up our tour. Basically, by 8 o'clock in the morning, Maude's British were broken, and his men were fleeing, and some of them were trying to rally here on this ridge.
Now, it was an unwinnable battle, and to his credit, he was outnumbered 4-1, and he still put up a hell of a fight.
Oh, God, yes. Really, all credit to Maude. I mean, he did a terrific job, and unfortunately, we didn't talk a whole lot about him specifically in this video, but the odds against him were just too high.
And back here behind us is a plaque that we believe, or it is believed, that a grave of American and British soldiers were buried after the battle. In fact, the bodies were buried by the Quaker farmers who lived here. Go figure, one of the most important battles of the war happened on the land of pacifists.
Princeton is just down the road in front of me, and some of the British fled in that direction after the battle, while others fled the opposite direction toward Cornwallis's approaching army.
In fact, Washington had captured Princeton by 9 a.m., but with Cornwallis hot on his heels, he abandoned the town pretty much immediately.
The Battle of Princeton marked the end of Washington's 10-day winter campaign. He'd beaten the British in 3 separate battles and restored much of the shame and embarrassment of 1776.
This was a lot of fun. I hope you guys enjoyed the tour as much as we do.
Yeah, I love doing these battlefield walks. If you missed our first battlefield walk on Antietam, make sure you go back and watch that. And of course, if you want to see this battle, 28mm, the Battle of Princeton, that video is available as well. And you can find out if our American players managed to keep Hugh Mercer alive.
And Washington.
And Washington. Losing him, automatic game ender.
Well, and if you like the tour, go and like the video and subscribe to Little Wars TV, and we'll see you here next week.